So, Prince William uncovered something buried inside Camilla's inner circle, something that had been hidden for over 26 years. And the moment his team confirmed what Laura Lopez had quietly walked into, everyone inside Kensington Palace understood there was no version of this story that ended without consequences. 2 pieces of jewelry, a black diamond pendant, and a sapphire bracelet, plus a promise made to a grieving teenage boy that had apparently never been kept. What looked like a private family matter was already crossing into constitutional territory, and William had already decided exactly what he was going to do about it. Before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed to Crown Watch so you never miss a royal investigation like this one, because the details buried inside this story are ones the headlines will never fully tell you. But to understand why William moved with the speed and precision of someone who had already been preparing for this moment, we need to go back to something that happened weeks earlier, far away from Sibby's, far away from any auction room, and very much behind closed palace doors. It arrived the way most devastating things do, quietly, without warning, buried inside what looked like routine correspondence. A member of staff at Kensington Palace was processing incoming auction documentation from Seabies when the image appeared on screen. Standard catalogue photography. 2 pieces of jewelry laid against a neutral background. The kind of image prepared for private appraisal logged under a civilian name, flagged for nothing in particular except someone in that room recognized them immediately. Not because they had seen them recently, because they hadn't seen them in over 2 decades and they were never supposed to appear anywhere again. The first piece was a black diamond pendant suspended on a fine chain, its setting unmistakably from a specific era. The second was a sapphire bracelet, intricate in its construction, the kind of piece that does not belong to the category of anonymous vintage jewelry. Both had been worn publicly. Both had been photographed. Both existed in documented palace records tied to a name that needed no introduction. Princess Diana, the staff member, did not send a routine reply to Suze. They did not file the image and move on. They picked up the phone. Within minutes, the image had reached the people who needed to see it. Within the hour, the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace had shifted entirely. Not loudly. There were no raised voices, no visible signs of crisis from the outside, just a particular quality of stillness that those familiar with the palace recognized as a moment before something very large and very deliberate begins to move. When William was shown the photograph, he looked at it for a long moment. He did not call Camilla. He did not request an informal conversation through family channels. He did not ask for a diplomatic explanation or a quiet resolution. He made one call to his legal team at Fair & Company, the firm that handles the Crown's most sensitive matters. And the conversation that followed was not exploratory. It was operational. The name attached to the Sabis catalog entry was Laura Lopez, Camilla's daughter, and the pieces she had brought to the auction house had been logged under her name as civilian property. Nothing special, nothing flagged, nothing that would raise an alarm to anyone who didn't know exactly what they were looking at. But that was precisely the problem. Someone at Kensington Palace did know exactly what they were looking at. What appeared to be a private appraisal was in legal terms something considerably more serious. By having the pieces officially catalogued under a civilian name, particularly pieces that had been kept outside the formal Crown Estate Registry for so long that modern documentation on them was effectively absent, the process would legitimize a claim of private ownership. The royal providence would not be removed dramatically. It would simply fade from the official record. And once these pieces existed as documented private property, recovering them through any legal mechanism became exponentially more complicated. William understood this. His legal team understood this. And in the quiet, controlled hours that followed, one thing became clear to everyone involved. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not carelessness. This was a plan. And it had come within a single auction catalog entry of working. But the jewelry was only the surface. What William had already set in motion weeks before that image arrived told a far larger story, one that Camilla's household was only beginning to understand. Weeks before the image arrived from spies, something had already shifted inside the palace quietly, structurally in the language of finance rather than confrontation. In May, William made a decision that those inside the royal estate system immediately understood as something other than what it appeared to be on paper. He liquidated 20% of the Duchy of Cornwall's entire commercial real estate portfolio. The figure involved was not modest. It was in the region of £500 million pulled from active markets in a single coordinated movement. The official statement was straightforward. Local housing initiatives, community reinvestment, language that sounded responsible, even generous, the kind of headline that generates approval rather than scrutiny. But inside the palace, among the advisors and financial administrators who understood how the Duchess estate system actually operated, the reaction was not approval. It was recognition. For years, more than 2 decades by some accounts, a network of private trusts and civilian-adjacent funds had been operating in the grey areas of the royal estates' financial architecture. Not illegally in any simple sense, but in ways that quietly routed wealth toward Camilla's circle rather than the direct line of succession. These arrangements had been constructed gradually, carefully, and in a manner designed to be unremarkable to anyone not looking for them specifically. William had been looking for them specifically, and in one coordinated financial movement he shut them down entirely. No negotiation, no transition period, no private conversation offering a graceful exit. He simply pulled the funding, and the message embedded in the method was impossible to misread for anyone familiar with what those funds have been doing. His own advisors had warned him. They told him directly that the king's household and Camilla's team would interpret this as a deliberate attack because that was precisely what it was. They told him it would cause serious disruption to relationships that the palace had spent years carefully managing. They told him the consequences would not remain contained to financial channels. William's response, by all accounts, was brief. The duchy resources existed to serve the people in the institution, not private interests operating in the margins of its estate. The decision had been made. There was no compromise offered because none had been intended. Inside Clarence's house, the movement registered immediately. Financial advisors began making calls. Legal teams began reviewing the structural exposure. And Camilla, who had spent 20 years developing an almost unparalleled instinct for palace politics, understood that the scale of what had just happened was not routine. What she did not yet fully understand was that the financial move was not the primary action. It was preparation. William had been building legal and institutional footing for something more specific, and the £500 million restructuring was simply the groundwork being laid before the Real confrontation arrived. That confrontation, when it came, would not announce itself in financial documents or press statements. It would arrive in the form of a catalogue image from a London auction house. And by the time anyone in Camilla's household had the chance to respond, William would already be 3 moves ahead. But to understand why the jewelry hit William with the force that it did, why his response was so immediate, so certain, and so completely without hesitation, you have to go back to a conversation that took place over 26 years ago. One that a grieving teenage boy was never meant to remember quite so clearly. The year was 2000. William was 17 years old. He was still by any honest measure a teenager in grief, navigating the particular kind of loss that does not announce itself cleanly and then recede, but instead reshapes everything quietly, permanently, without permission. His mother had been gone for 3 years, long enough that the world had largely moved on. Not long enough that he had at some point during that period William came across a photograph. The details of exactly where or how have never been made fully public, but what the photograph contained has since become the center of everything. In it, Diana was wearing 2 pieces of jewelry, a black diamond pendant and a sapphire bracelet. Pieces he recognized, pieces that carried the specific, irreplaceable weight of personal memory rather than institutional record. He asked about them. The conversation that followed was handled with care. The kind of careful, measured gentleness that adults deploy when they are managing a difficult truth in front of someone too young to push back effectively. He was told that the pieces had been put away, that they were no longer accessible, that they were being looked after properly in the right place by the right people. He was, in other words, told not to worry. The pieces were subsequently placed in a secured repository at Highgrove, locked, kept off the formal Crown Estate registry, not listed, not catalogued, not officially documented in a system that would have made them traceable and recoverable through standard institutional channels. For all practical purposes, they existed in a kind of deliberate administrative shadow. For 26 years, they were not seen, not publicly, not in any auction record, not in any official inventory, not anywhere that William or anyone acting on his behalf could have pointed to and said, "These belong here and they are not where they should be." And then Laura Lopez walked into Sue's What made the moment so significant was not simply that the pieces had reappeared. It was the specific nature of how they had been kept invisible for so long and what that invisibility now revealed about the intention behind it. These were not pieces that had been lost. They had not been misplaced through carelessness or administrative oversight. They had been kept in a gray area outside official documentation, in a position where the question of ownership could never be cleanly answered by the record, because there was no record designed to answer it until someone decided to create one under a civilian name at a London auction house. For William, the image from Spies did not arrive as a surprise in the way most surprises arrive. It arrived as a confirmation, the kind that lands not with shock, but with a cold, clarifying recognition, the feeling of understanding, finally and completely, something you had always half known, but never been able to prove. He had been 17 when he was told those pieces were safe. He was now a grown man, a husband, a father, the heir apparent to the British throne. In this time, there was no one in the room with the authority to tell him not to worry. But knowing what had happened was not the same as having the legal standing to act on it. For that, William needed something the palace had never seen used quite this way before. And he had already prepared it. William did not make a phone call. He did not send a message through palace channels. He did not request a formal meeting through the usual administrative process that governs communication between royal households. He drove to Sandringham himself, and he brought a leather binder. Those who were present in the peripheral rooms of the estate that day have described the atmosphere as unusually still, not tense in any visible dramatic sense, but carrying the particular quality of stillness that experienced palace staff associate with conversations that will not be repeated outside the room in which they happen. Inside that binder was a document that William's legal team had prepared with extraordinary precision. A letters patent for asset reclassification, a constitutional framework grounded in existing royal legal precedent that addressed a specific and deeply uncomfortable scenario. It stated in the careful, unambiguous language of institutional law that if the reigning monarch was unable to adequately protect the crown's historical properties due to diminished physical capacity or compromised executive function, the heir apparent held the legal standing to petition the Privy Council directly. The implications of that petition were not subtle. It would effectively position William as Prince Regent, stripping the king of executive authority over those specific assets until the matter was resolved through constitutional process. William placed the binder on the table and explained quietly and without apparent emotion what it contained. He told his father that there were two available paths. Charles could sign the decree before him, officially reclassifying Diana's jewelry as crown property held exclusively for the direct line of succession, bypassing Camilla's household entirely. Or William would take the matter to the Privy Council himself, and the question of the king's capacity to protect the institution's assets would become a matter of formal constitutional record. This was not a bluff. William had the documentation. He had the legal standing, and Charles, advised by his own team, understood both of those things with complete clarity. What happened in the silence between that explanation and the king's response has never been publicly described. The particular weight of a father and son sitting across from one another, one holding a document that questions the other's capacity to leave, and both of them knowing that the document is legally sound, is not the kind of moment that translates into official palace records. Charles signed one signature, and with it Diana's jewelry was formally reclassified as crown property designated exclusively for the direct line of succession, entirely outside the reach of Camilla's household or anyone connected to it. What is most significant about that moment is not the legal outcome, though the legal outcome was decisive. It is what the signing itself represented. A reigning monarch acknowledging through the act of that signature that his heir had both the standing and the willingness to remove power from him if he refused to act, that the institutional balance between them was no longer what it had formerly appeared to be. Charles walked out of that room still a king, but something had shifted permanently, and everyone who needed to know it knew it. The document was signed, but a signature, however consequential, is only the beginning of what the institution must then be made to do. And the machinery that William set in motion next moved faster than anyone in Camilla's household had anticipated. The king's signature dried, and within hours the palace ceased to be a family matter. What followed was not emotional. It was not dramatic in any visible sense. It was procedural. The kind of cold, coordinated institutional movement that the British legal system executes with a precision that has very little in common with the messy human conflicts that trigger it. William's legal team at Farrer and Company had not been waiting for the signature to begin preparing. They had been preparing for considerably longer than that. The moment authorization was confirmed, the documents already drafted were filed. On the 23rd of May, a moreover injunction was submitted to the High Court. For those unfamiliar with the instrument, a moreover injunction is among the most aggressive financial tools available under British law. It does not negotiate. It does not issue warnings. It does not allow for the gradual unwinding of assets or the quiet movement of funds to safer ground. It freezes everything simultaneously, completely, and with the full enforcement authority of the court behind it. Every account associated with Laura Lopez, every investment portfolio, every trust fund connected to her name blocked. Alerts went out to Coates, to Barclays, to every major financial institution that held anything under her name. The calls did not arrive as requests. They arrived as legal directives, and compliance was not optional. Laura's entire financial life stopped. She could not move money. She could not liquidate assets. She could not transfer, withdraw, or redirect anything. She was, in the language of the law, completely paralyzed, and she had no mechanism through which to immediately respond. At 5:30 in the morning on the 24th of May, before most of London had any reason to be awake, officers arrived at Laura Lopez's estate in Wiltshire. This was not a courtesy visit. This was a High Court enforcement order accompanied by a ministerial-level search warrant, a document that carries a weight of institutional authority that cannot be deflected by social position, family connection, or any form of informal appeal. The search was conducted. The black diamond pendant was found. The sapphire bracelet was found. Both were documented, photographed under official record, and seized. The process was thorough, precise, and completed without the kind of public spectacle that would have made it a headline before William was ready for it to be one. Simultaneously, his team had obtained strict confidentiality orders from the court. Orders that prevented mainstream media outlets from connecting the asset freeze to the royal collection. Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal had already begun tracking unusual movements in accounts tied to a prominent British name. Financial analysts were noting the patterns publicly, but the legal wall around the story's royal dimension held. The pieces existed in the coverage, the financial freeze, the unusual banking activity, but their meaning was legally sealed. Camilla's legal team had also been contacted by this point. Their first instinct was sovereign immunity, a constitutional protection that, if applicable, could potentially shield Laura from the legal proceedings. Their lawyers told them with considerable directness that it would not work. Sovereign immunity covers the reigning monarch and, in specific official context, the Queen Consort. It does not extend to private citizens. Laura Lopez, under the framework William's team had constructed, was not being treated as a protected member of the royal household. She was being treated as a civilian in possession of misappropriated crown property. And the law in that context was entirely on William's side. The legal machinery had moved faster than Camilla's household could respond. But what came next was something she had never lost before, and losing it would prove in its own way more devastating than any court order. There was a particular kind of power that does not announce itself through titles or ceremonies or official appointments. It announces itself through access, through the ability to pick up a phone and have the right person answer, to place a quiet word with the right journalist and watch the narrative shift, to manage the story before the story manages you. For 20 years, that had been Camilla's greatest and most reliable weapon. And on the morning of the 24th of May, William took it from her entirely. The Buckingham Palace press office, the institutional apparatus through which royal households communicate with, manage, and when necessary redirect the British media, was placed under a communication lockdown. No statements, no background briefings, no informal conversations with sympathetic correspondents, no carefully worded denials, nothing issued externally without direct authorization from Kensington Palace. For a woman who had spent 2 decades transforming herself from the most publicly despised figure in the monarchy into something approaching acceptance through sheer relentless mastery of exactly this kind of quiet press management. The silence was not merely inconvenient. It was existential. Camilla had always understood that her position inside the institution was not simply a matter of legal title or royal appointment. It had been constructed carefully and over an enormous span of time through the management of public perception. She had endured years of hostility. She had waited. She had worked. She had shaped narratives, cultivated relationships with the right people in the right newsrooms, and gradually, painfully, gradually moved herself from the margins of public sympathy towards something more stable. William understood this as well as anyone, which is precisely why he moved against it first. Inside Clarence House, the atmosphere in the days that followed the acid freeze was described by those familiar with the household as one of frantic stillness, a place where urgent panic conversations were happening constantly and none of them were producing anything useful. Legal advisors were cycling through options that kept arriving at the same dead ends. Press contacts were being reached who could not legally do anything with what they were being told. Every avenue that Camilla's team attempted to open had already been closed. Laura Lopez, for her part, signed the legal agreement that the High Court audit ultimately produced. She surrendered all claim to the 2 recovered pieces. In exchange, a portion of her frozen accounts was released, enough to cover administrative and legal costs, nothing more. She disappeared from the active news cycle, not dramatically, but completely in the way that people disappear when there was nothing left publicly to fight over. On the 14th of June, when the High Court audit formally concluded, William released a statement. His tone was measured, quiet, entirely without performance. He said that his mother's legacy was not a commodity to be bargained over or have its history obscured, that the boundary had been set. Then he announced the Diana Heritage Trust, a legal entity constructed with terms described by those who reviewed them as ironclad. Every piece of jewelry and personal artifact belonging to Diana, officially documented and recoverable, was now designated exclusively for Catherine, Princess of Wales, and in time for Princess Charlotte. No other household, no other claimant, no pathway for access that did not run directly through the next generation of the direct line of succession. It was by any measure a complete and permanent dismantling of whatever influence Camilla's circle had quietly accumulated around Diana's legacy. But the audit had also found something else, something that changed the shape of everything that had just happened and made the recovered pieces feel suddenly like the smallest part of a much larger story. Because the 2 pieces William had recovered were not, as it turned out, the only ones missing. And what the audit revealed next stopped everyone in the room. The audit was supposed to close the matter. It did not close the matter. What the High Court review uncovered contained within a classified file that subsequently leaked from the Ministry of Justice was information that reframed everything that had happened in the preceding weeks. Not as a conclusion, but as a surface. The 2 pieces recovered from Laura Lopez's wheelchair estate were not the full extent of what was missing from the Highgrove repository. They were in fact the only 2 pieces that had not already been moved. The repository had contained 14 documented artifacts in total. William's team had recovered 2. 12 remained unaccounted for. They were not simply missing in the administrative sense, misplaced, overlooked, awaiting proper cataloging. The forensic paper trail that the audit produced told a different story entirely. The 12 pieces had been moved with deliberate coordination, transferred through channels designed to obscure their origin and destination, and were now held inside an anonymous private holding company registered in the state of Delaware. Delaware, not London, not anywhere within reach of the British legal system that had just moved so swiftly and so decisively to recover the 2 pieces at Sabes. Whoever had structured this had understood with considerable sophistication exactly where the boundaries of British legal jurisdiction ended. The choice of Delaware was not accidental. It was architectural. These pieces had been placed somewhere that a High Court injunction could not touch, that a ministerial search warrant could not reach, and that Far Company, for all their institutional authority, had no straightforward mechanism to recover them from. The leaked file contained one additional detail that stopped people cold when they read it. The forensic trail carried a code name for whoever sat at the center of the larger operation. It was referred to in the document's careful language as the Monasetto Connection. For anyone familiar with the geography of the royal family's recent history, that word required no further explanation. Monasetto is a place. It is also in the context of this story a direction pointing towards someone who left the United Kingdom permanently, who has spent years navigating a complicated and publicly documented estrangement from the institution, and who would have both the resources and the motivation to hold pieces of Diana's personal legacy in a private collection beyond the reach of the British Crown. Someone, in other words, with everything to gain from leverage and nothing left to lose by holding it. For William, the personal weight of this revelation existed on a level that no legal document could fully capture. He had fought to recover his mother's jewelry. He had cornered his father in a room at Sandringham. He had mobilized the full force of the Crown's legal architecture. He had won completely institutionally, decisively, and he had recovered 2 pieces out of 14. The Diana Heritage Trust protected everything that remained within reach. Its terms were ironclad, its designation permanent, its legal construction designed to ensure that no one outside the direct line of succession could ever access what it contained. It was in every sense the right response to what had happened. But 12 pieces were in Delaware, and the trust, however perfectly constructed, could not reach across an ocean. What William had secured was the future. What he could not recover was already gone, helped by someone who understood with uncomfortable precision exactly what they were holding. The palace had won the legal battle entirely. But the story, it turned out, had already moved somewhere the law could not follow, and the public was about to find out just enough of it to ask the questions nobody in an official position was prepared to answer. The confidentiality orders held, but they could only hold so much. What the British press could not report directly, the financial press had already begun circling from the outside. Bloomberg's analysts had been tracking unusual freezing patterns across several major British banking institutions for weeks. Patterns that taken individually might suggest routine legal proceedings, but taken together pointed towards something coordinated at a level that routine proceedings simply do not reach. The Wall Street Journal had assigned people to the story. Neither outlet could name the royal connection legally, but the shape of what they were describing was visible enough that anyone paying close attention could begin to draw their own conclusions. And people were paying very close attention. The story that emerged in public was not the full story. It could not be given the legal walls around its most significant details. But the fragments that did surface were sufficient to ignite the particular kind of public conversation that the palace has always feared most. Not the kind it can manage, but the kind it cannot locate the edges of. Diana's name entered the conversation first through the announcement of the Heritage Trust. William's statement, measured, quiet, deliberately final, was reported internationally within hours. In the United Kingdom, the response was immediate and complicated. In the United States, in Australia, in Canada, in every country where Diana's memory had taken on the quality of something personal rather than merely historical, the reaction was something closer to protective fury. The idea that pieces of her jewelry had been kept in an administrative shadow for over 2 decades, potentially moved across international borders, held beyond the reach of her own sons. This was not abstract constitutional history to the people who responded to it. It was felt. Royal commentators and constitutional historians found themselves being asked questions they were not entirely comfortable answering. On record, the relationship between an heir apparent and a reigning monarch with declining health and the precise legal circumstances under which the former could petition for effective authority over the latter had not been examined publicly in living memory. Academics who specialized in crown succession law were suddenly appearing on international broadcasts speaking carefully around the edges of a situation whose specifics they were not authorized to confirm. The questions the public were asking were not complicated. They were simply unanswerable through official channels. What was a Montecito connection? Why had the palace not addressed 12 missing pieces publicly? If the High Court had moved so decisively on 2 artifacts, what was preventing the same legal machinery from pursuing the remaining 12? And the question that sat beneath all the others, unspoken but unmistakable, who had been coordinating this from outside the country? And for how long? Clarence House issued nothing. Kensington Palace's statement remained exactly what William had made it. A single deliberate paragraph about legacy and boundaries, designed to be final rather than to invite dialogue. The palace's silence was not accidental. It was the only remaining instrument of control available to an institution that had in every other respect already said everything it intended to say through the legal system. But silence in the era of international media and financial journalism is not the same as containment. It is simply the palace's preferred way of confirming that the conversation has gone somewhere it cannot follow. And then William did something that required no words at all because the message he delivered next was never meant to be spoken. There are moments inside the British monarchy that are not designed to be understood by everyone. They are designed to be understood by exactly the right people and to be understood by them completely without a single word being spoken aloud. Several weeks after the High Court audit concluded, William and Catherine appeared together at a formal royal engagement. The occasion itself was unremarkable by the standards of the calendar. A scheduled public appearance of the kind that fills the royal diary throughout the year, attended by the expected gathering of officials, dignitaries, and members of the press whose job it is to document exactly what they are shown. What Catherine was wearing that evening was not unremarkable. Around her wrist, positioned with a quiet deliberateness of something that has been considered very carefully before being placed, there was a piece of Diana's jewelry, not the sapphire bracelet, but covered from Wiltshire. Not the black diamond pendant that had been seized and officially reclassified. A different piece, one that had always been properly documented, one that had never left the official record, one that belonged without legal ambiguity of any kind, exactly where it now appeared, on the wrist of the woman who would one day be queen. No announcement accompanied it. No briefing was given to the press ahead of the appearance. No member of Kensington Palace's communications team pointed it out or contextualized it for waiting journalists. It was simply there, in the way that the most deliberate things are sometimes simply there, visible to everyone, explained to no one, requiring no explanation for those who already knew what to look for. The photographers captured it. The images circulated within hours among those who had been following the preceding weeks with any degree of attention. The response was not confusion. It was recognition, a quiet collective understanding that what they were looking at was the closing statement of an argument that had been conducted entirely through institutional mechanisms and had now arrived finally at its symbolic conclusion. Diana's legacy was here. It was documented. It was protected. It was being worn publicly and without apology by the next Princess of Wales, and in time by the woman who would pass it forward to the generation that came after her. Camilla was present at the same engagement. She arrived and departed with a composure that 2 decades of public life inside the monarchy had made second nature. Her expression gave nothing away. Her bearing was, as always, precisely what the occasion called for. She said the right things to the right people at the right moments, and she left without incident. But the distance between the two women that evening, not the physical distance, which was unremarkable, but the symbolic distance, the institutional distance, the distance that everyone in that room could feel without being able to point to any specific moment that created it, was not something that composure could bridge. It was not hostility. It was not confrontation. It was something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. It was the clarity of a line that had been drawn, held, and made visible, and that everyone present understood would not be moved again. The jewelry said nothing. It communicated everything. But what no symbolic gesture, however precisely delivered, could resolve were the 12 pieces that remained beyond reach, and what the person holding them might one day choose to do with them. When the immediate noise faded, the legal filings, the frozen accounts, the court hearings, the carefully worded statements, what remained was something the palace has always been better at managing than explaining. A permanent shift, quiet, structural, and entirely without ceremony. Charles was still king. His title had not changed. His schedule continued. His public appearances proceeded with the dignified regularity that the institution requires of its monarch. Regardless of what has happened behind closed doors, the palace maintained, as it always does, the external appearance of stability of an institution that processes difficulty internally and presents composure externally, because that is precisely what it has been built to do across centuries of practice. But inside the architecture of actual authority, in the rooms where real decisions are made, in the conversations between advisors who understand how power actually moves, something had changed that could not be unchanged. A king had signed a document under pressure from his son. He had acknowledged through that signature that his heir possessed both the legal standing and the personal resolve to remove executive authority from him if the institution's assets were not protected. That is not a moment that exists only in the past. It reshapes every conversation that follows it, every decision, every negotiation between the two households that will eventually require the participation of both. William had not needed a public victory. He had never pursued one. The brilliance of what he executed, and it was by any measured assessment brilliantly executed, was that it required no public theater at all. No press conference, no dramatic revelation, no moment designed for cameras, just legal documents, institutional mechanisms, and the quiet, devastating application of constitutional leverage in a private room at Sandringham. Camilla retained her title. She remained queen. Consort. She continued to appear alongside the king at official engagements with a composure that has always been her most reliable public instrument. But the financial networks that had quietly supported her circle for more than 2 decades were gone. The press apparatus she had spent years cultivating had been briefly but decisively taken from her hands at the precise moment she needed it most. And her daughter had signed a legal agreement that closed every remaining door permanently. What Camilla had built over 20 years was not destroyed loudly. It was dismantled methodically, instrument by instrument, without giving her a single moment in which to mount a meaningful defense. By the time she understood the full scope of what was happening, it was already over. The Diana Heritage Trust stood. Its terms remained ironclad. Catherine would carry Diana's legacy forward. Charlotte would receive it after her. The line of inheritance was legally sealed in a manner that required no goodwill, no cooperation, and no future negotiation from anyone outside it. And 12 pieces remained in Delaware. That is where the story refuses to close. Not with the recovered pendant, not with the sapphire bracelet now safely documented. Not with a symbolic appearance that communicated everything the palace would never say aloud, but with 12 artifacts in an anonymous holding company connected to a code name in a leaked government file held by someone with the resources and the reasons to keep them indefinitely. William secured what he could reach. He built legal walls around everything that remained. But some things once moved beyond a certain distance do not come back. The 2 pieces came home. The 12 did not. And somewhere in the silence between those 2 facts lives the story the palace will spend years deciding whether to tell.